Okay, let's unpack this. Picture this. You're trying to learn English, maybe for college, maybe for work, and the textbooks just feel, well, off.
Yeah.
Like they were written for someone else, you know? In another time, teaching things that don't quite match what you need to actually use the language.
Frustrating, right?
Super frustrating. It's a really common experience, apparently, and it turns out there's a specific, research-backed way to fix this problem.
Absolutely. And in this deep dive, we're looking at source material from a fascinating research paper that zeroes right in on exactly this issue. It's specifically looking at college students learning English in Indonesia, where it's actually a required subject.
Right. So our mission today is to really dig into this study, pull out the key insights. What did the students and the teachers themselves say was missing? What makes teaching materials truly effective for them?
And crucially, how can this structured process they talk about called needs analysis, how can that be the absolute cornerstone of getting it right?
We'll uncover some surprising details, I think, about what learners prioritize, maybe not what you'd expect at all, the real-world problems they face, and even how they prefer to learn.
Yeah, it's kind of a shortcut to understanding a really critical piece of effective education and, material design.
So let's dive in. Let's set the scene a bit, based on the source. English isn't exactly new in Indonesia. It's been compulsory for decades. Schools, universities.
We're talking official government regulations going way back, late 60s for schools, and specific rules for higher education, too. It's been around.
But despite that long history, the research points to this persistent challenge, doesn't it? A lot of college students still graduate with, surprisingly low English skills, especially when it comes to actually using it, communicating.
Yeah, there's a definite gap between the requirement and the actual outcome.
And the source highlights several reasons previous research has found for this. Curriculum issues, syllabus design problems, often because they haven't been built on that crucial foundation of needs analysis.
Right. And you also have those practical challenges, like crowded classrooms, noisy environments.
Yeah.
And sometimes teachers may be needing more support or training in language teaching methods specifically. But the paper we're focusing on really zooms in on that first point. Yeah. The materials and the syllabi that are developed without truly understanding the learners.
Right. So instead of getting objective data, materials often end up being based on just, what teachers think students need. Their gut feeling, maybe. Subjective beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. And the core argument is pretty simple, but really powerful. If you don't deeply understand the student's situation, what they need the language for, how they learn best, the materials you create just won't be appropriate.
They won't be effective.
They won't be practical or realistic, really, for helping them master the language. They just won't connect.
Okay, so here's where the study itself gets really interesting, because they decided to tackle this head-on using a really systematic approach. It's called the development research method.
Yeah, think of it like building something properly. This method has three main phases: input, development, and output. And that absolutely critical first phase, the input step, that's where they did the heavy lifting, the needs analysis.
And this wasn't just a few people, right? They got data from 137 participants, students currently studying their lectures, and even recent graduates who are now, out there using English or trying to.
They use questionnaires, interviews, trying to get the whole picture.
And the goal of this input phase was super clear. Figure out two main things. First, the students' linguistic needs. So what specific language skills, what knowledge do they actually need?
Yeah, the what. And second, their learning needs, which gets into the whole process, right? What problems do they run into while they're learning?
Yeah.
And how did they prefer to learn?
The what and the how makes sense.
Digging into the findings from this needs analysis is, it's incredibly insightful. Let's look at the linguistic needs first, specifically for speaking, because that was a key focus. When they asked students to rate their current abilities, grammar got a poor score.
Ouch.
Yeah, average 1.44 on a 1 to 4 scale, so pretty low self-assessment there.
What about vocab and pronunciation?
They were a bit higher, 1.7 and 1.63, rated closer to fair. So, they felt generally weak, but grammar seemed like the biggest struggle in their own assessment.
Okay, but then here's the fascinating shift you mentioned. When they asked about priorities for learning to speak.
The picture changed dramatically.
Yeah.
Both vocabulary and pronunciation jumped way, way up. Rated as very important, scores around 3.9.
Whoa, that's a massive difference. They feel grammar is weak, but they think vocab and pronunciation are more important for actually speaking.
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive at first, maybe. But the study quotes a student who really nails it, saying learning grammar was an obstacle for fluency, just getting stuck on rules.
Huh. Interesting.
And while the researchers, they acknowledge grammar is essential, it's the sentence-making machine. This feedback led them to a key conclusion. For initial speaking materials, vocabulary and pronunciation should probably get first priority.
Right.
Maybe introduce grammar later in a unit or give it a smaller focus initially. It shows you really have to meet the learner where they are based on their perception of what's useful for communication right now.
That distinction is crucial, isn't it, between what I find hard and what I actually think I need to talk to someone? Not always the same thing.
It really highlights why asking the learners directly is so vital. You can't just assume. And the needs analysis got incredibly specific about what content they preferred to. For learning vocab and pronunciation, students strongly wanted real-life topics, rated very important, 3.51.
And they didn't just stop there, did they? The study identified the specific topics.
Oh yeah, things like classroom, cooking and food, days and daily routine, stuff relevant to their lives. It gives material designers a concrete list to work with. That's gold.
Yeah.
They also identified basic grammar points students felt were important for those topics, things like pronouns, adjectives, articles. So you have the topics and the basic building blocks they feel they need within those topics.
Okay, so that covers the skills, the content they need and want. Let's shift to the how, their learning needs, the problems they face, how they prefer to learn. What did the analysis uncover there?
Well, it uncovered some really significant obstacles, and some of the most prominent were psychological.
Like what?
Students reported frequently feeling shy, being afraid of making errors, afraid of being criticized by others. And these weren't minor things. They rated them as often occur.
Wow. That's a massive barrier to learning a language, isn't it? I mean, if you're terrified of opening your mouth.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how much vocab you know if you're too scared to use it.
Yeah.
Mother tongue interference was also common, which is understandable. Plus, limited knowledge of topics, which links right back to that preference for real-life topics they do know about.
Mm-hmm.
And, not surprisingly, limited linguistic resources. The very vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar they felt weak in. It's all connected.
Understanding those problems is so key because, like the source says, it directly tells you what teaching methods might work best.
Precisely.
Like, if you know shyness is a huge issue, it immediately suggests you need activities that lower anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Maybe participative games, basic phrases in a relaxed setting.
Exactly that. It tells you the environment, the type of activity. It's just as important as the actual content. The analysis also looked into their learning attitudes, their preferences, their styles.
Okay.
So when asked how they preferred to learn vocabulary, the top answers were things like using vocab to communicate, learning vocab in conversations, and listening and repeating vocabulary.
All very active, interactive methods. Makes sense. What about pronunciation?
For pronunciation, the standout preference, rated very highly, was learning from native English speakers' voice recordings.
Interesting. Why do you think that is? Is it about wanting to sound perfectly native?
Well, the study suggests it's maybe more about intelligibility, learning to be understood clearly. Mimicking native speakers is seen as a powerful way to get there. Not necessarily accent reduction, but clarity.
Got it.
And this raises a really important practical question for anyone designing materials, doesn't it? How do you actually integrate that authentic listen and repeat audio effectively, especially when you're building around these specific needs and topics?
Yeah, it's not enough just to know they prefer it. You have to figure out how to deliver that practice in a useful way.
And looking at overall learning styles, the study characterized these students as primarily communicative and concrete learners, their most preferred activities. They paint a really clear picture.
Like what?
Talking to friends in English, language games, using films and videos, talking in pairs, learning in small groups, role play.
That sounds like a really dynamic social classroom environment. What about, say, studying grammar rules alone?
Yeah. Much less preferred. Significantly lower scores.
Yeah.
It just reinforces that interactive, engaging social learning is absolutely crucial for this group.
Right.
And the source really emphasizes this point, a mismatch here. If the teaching methods don't align with student learning styles and preferences, it can lead to negative attitudes. And that, in turn, just crushes language performance. Attitude is huge.
So, okay, let's pull all this together. You've got their self-assessed abilities, low grammar, fair vocab pronunciation. their communication priorities, vocab and pronunciation first for speaking, preferred content, real-life topics, basic grammar related to them, the psychological hurdles, especially shyness, and the strong preference for interactive social learning games, audio, group work. What did the study actually do with all this rich data?
Right. That brings us neatly to the next phase, the development step. Armed with this incredibly detailed map of what the learners needed and preferred, they could then formulate course aims and objectives that directly address those things.
Oh.
The goal became helping students communicate effectively and confidently in everyday situations, focusing on building that vocabulary, pronunciation, and basic grammar foundation that the analysis highlighted.
And the content selection, the organization that flowed directly from the needs analysis findings, too.
Exactly. The topics identified as most relevant to students' personal and social lives, they got prioritized. They even refined the list a bit, like they initially considered classroom based on student preference.
Oh, wow.
But after talking to teachers, they realized students probably already knew most of that specific vocab, so they skipped it in the actual prototype. A real-world adjustment based on combining different data points.
Smart. Okay, so input development.
Okay.
Then finally, the output step, designing the actual teaching material.
Right, developing lesson plans and actual prototypes for the units. And the source describes a prototype unit that's structured specifically around all those needs analysis insights. Each unit, covering one topic, was divided into 3 distinct lessons.
Okay, break it down for us. Lesson A.
Lesson A was called Skill Getting. This is where they provide the core linguistic building blocks, the stuff identified as high priority.
Yeah.
So focused vocabulary and pronunciation drills.
Right.
Followed by pair practice. The idea is to help students really internalize the form of the language and start connecting it to potential communication, laying the foundation.
Got it. Foundation, based on what the analysis said was most important. Then lesson B.
Lesson B is skill using. This is critical. It's where they bridge that gap from just knowing the language forms to actually using them communicatively. Addressing those learning needs and preferences we talked about, especially the shyness and the desire for interaction.
How did they do that?
Through things called functional communication activities, basically. Using language in specific real-life scenarios, like the ones from the preferred topic lists.
Like ordering food, maybe, based on the cooking and food topic.
Precisely. And also social interaction activities like half-dialogue role plays. Stuff designed to get them talking, lower the anxiety, and leverage that preference for communicative, interactive learning in a, safer space.
Makes perfect sense. And the last one, lesson C.
Lesson C was the review. This assesses learning, often through language games, directly pulling in that preferred learning style again.
Nice.
It also included a presentation of the grammar rules that were sort of implicitly used in the unit's communication activities.
So bringing the grammar back in, but linked to the communication they just did.
Exactly. And maybe some extra class written grammar exercises for reinforcement. So it's a blend, really. It uses their preferred interactive methods, but also brings in the explicit grammar focus identified as important, just maybe structured differently towards the end of the cycle.
This whole structured approach, then, born directly from that really deep needs analysis, resulted in a methodology and a prototype unit.
Yeah, and the researchers believe this whole process can be a really reliable blueprint, a guideline for developing effective materials for the entire course, specifically tailored to these learners and their needs.
It really demonstrates how starting with the learner, truly understanding them, can lead to a much more relevant and hopefully effective teaching approach.
Absolutely.
So what's the big takeaway then from this deep dive into needs analysis for English teaching materials, specifically in Indonesia here? It feels like a powerful real-world example, proving that effective education isn't about guessing, is it? It's about deeply understanding the people you're actually teaching.
Couldn't agree more. The needs analysis gave them concrete, data-driven insights.
Yeah.
It wasn't just feelings. It was, here's how students see their struggles. Grammar's tough. Here are their priorities for actually communicating. Vocab and pronunciation come first for speaking fluency, initially anyway. Here's the content they actually care about learning real-life topics. Here are the significant emotional barriers they face. The shyness factor is huge. And here's how they clearly prefer to learn interactively, socially, using games, using authentic audio.
And the brilliance, I think, is seeing how that data directly translated into a specific methodology in a prototype unit. It wasn't just what to teach, but how to structure the whole learning experience to tackle those problems and leverage those preferences.
Yeah, the connection is really clear. Now, while this study successfully showed how you can use needs analysis to design materials, and they created this promising prototype, It does leave us with this final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Okay.
The study developed the materials based on the needs, which is great. But it didn't then go on to test them in the classroom over time to measure their actual impact on student learning.
Ah, right. The follow-through.
Exactly. How do you go about proving that these needs analysis-based materials truly work, that they make a real difference? What kind of follow-up study would you actually need to track student progress and confirm that this data-driven design really leads to better speaking proficiency out there in the real world?
That's a really good question. How do you measure the real-world effectiveness? Something to definitely consider as you think about applying these kinds of principles yourself in whatever field you're in.